Let's just take it from the top. Be right back. Near and far, young and old, people of all age, shape, ability, and gender, welcome to Story Circle! Today we're going to be covering something a little interesting. We're going to be going through the history and impact of the webcomic Homestuck. Now, I've been into Homestuck for a couple of years now, since probably the middle of college. And it's been going on for even longer than that, although it is over now. But it's sort of impenetrable from the outside. If you just take a glance at it, you don't really get it. It's just these relatively simply drawn kids getting into stupid stuff from whatever you can tell. And then when someone tries to explain it, it usually ends up sounding like gobbledygook because they're talking about universes and insipospheres and capsulogs and other lingo words from the series itself. So what I'm going to try to do today is just give a basic understanding of what Homestuck is, as well as why people care, what it means to people, and why it's such a big deal that the game Hiveswap is coming out tomorrow, which is the Homestuck video game, which does not tell the story of Homestuck, so don't try to go that and figure it out. Anything I say here will probably not be super impactful to that other than the themes. I'm just trying to explain why there's going to be a lot of people excited tomorrow. Alright, so let's start from the beginning, with a man named Andrew Hussie. Now, Andrew Hussie is a webcomic artist. He started very simplistic and has improved since. He originally started off on his website, which was the MS Paint Adventures, with a series called Problem Sleuth. Now, Problem Sleuth was pretty much Problem Sleuth and the entire MS Paint Adventures setup. The approach that they had was that it was emulating the style of old choose-your-own-adventure books or text-based adventure games. So you would be given a setup of a person's in a room, and then you would give prompts. And now, the interesting part of that is that it was a webcomic, though. So instead of being an actual game where you're playing through this type of thing, you just get a panel which looked something like this, that has a image, often animated but not always, a chunk of text, and then a prompt for what you would like to do. Now that prompt there was the form of a command, like retrieve arms or break bucket. They would be simple but would lead the story onwards. Now, by doing that, it seemed like it was a game. And at the very, very beginning, and through all of Problem Sleuth, it actually was. All of these commands were fan-generated. They were sent in, and so that's why for the first couple hundred pages or whatever, and when I say a page, I mean something like this, where it's just an image, some text, and so forth. But for that first chunk, it had this very back-and-forth feel to it, where it would have the characters going to do something and the omnipresent narrator who was giving these commands. And there would be some, joking back and forth about, why would I do that? That's a stupid command, that type of thing. So that was the structure of it. The other big storytelling implement that they used was chat logs, or as they called them in the comic, pester logs, which were pretty much these walls of text in the form of an AIM chat log or something of that time that would just be dialogue between the characters. Homestuck used this as its main storytelling mechanism. You only got one image per page, but you could have lines upon lines upon lines of pester logs, just of dialogue with these two characters going back and forth, a lot more densely than you would in a traditional comic. So because of that, a lot of information got conveyed. Oh, hi there, welcome. I I honestly forgot I had that turned on. Anyway, the comic proceeded in that fashion, that it was pretty much set up to be mostly about the characters themselves, and because of that, they got very well fleshed out, and people found themselves getting attached to them. As it progressed, it built up a bit of a cult following because of its setting and the way that it was portrayed, and it was just interesting and funny. And so it expanded, and to the point where there were like thousands of people trying to put in these commands. And the about at Act 4, Hussey stepped in and decided that he would just tell the story from this point forward. He kept the same format, but it became implausible to actually do it in that format when you were getting thousands of submissions for each one. Or rather, it became irrelevant, because if you have that many submissions, he was never under the impression of picking like the most popular one. He would just pick the one that was like that struck him as interesting. And if he was doing that from among thousands of things, he was pretty much making it up anyway. So why not just make it the slightly different, more concise way of approaching things? Now, what that let him do was it let him tell a incredibly complex story. Now, that is one of the major reasons that people don't read Homestuck. But for now, let's focus on why they do. The story in general is about a set of kids who play a video game online with each other and destroy the world. That is in Act 3, roughly. Like, it happens pretty close out of the gate, and is enough of a non-issue that I don't really consider it all that much of a spoiler. That's the kind of comic that Homestuck is. It's very, like, big and very strange, and the reason that it's so engaging is because it just plays by its own rules. But, let's go back to the kids for a moment. The kids are important, and so are the trolls, which, God, I don't mean to do that. So are the trolls, because these 16 characters or so, I can't get it to do that. Alright, whatever. These 16 characters or so, are pretty much, between them, able to be a way to project yourself to anything. Because of the way that they're structured, the way that they are a little bit stereotypical, but not completely, they are very much relatable, because they're all kids, and very much varied enough that you can see bits and pieces of yourself in any number of them. And they made a point of having this variety of characters, and also of never excluding people. They always kept things vague if they could. Like, there are very few people with, very few characters with, like, canon sexual persuasions, or, like, canon races even. Like, even though they are drawn the color white, it's intentionally white and not, like, peach, or, like, white people's skin, because the author made a point of saying that these characters are whatever gender identity, race, sexuality that you project onto them, as long as it doesn't, like, come directly into conflict with what actually happened. But even that, the approach that people took was that they saw themselves in these characters, and these characters were their way to participate with the story. And that's why it became such a big deal with the, like, younger kids. Like, from people from, like, 12 to 17 were really, really, like, clicking with Homestuck because of the way that it portrayed these characters, and that it didn't exclude them. There was always a place. And one of the major themes that it approached, was this quote that I found that's pretty much, being a kid and growing up, it's hard and nobody understands. That's a major premise of Homestuck. The entire approach of this series is that being a kid is hard and weird and wacky, and everything doesn't line up clean, it doesn't line up easy, and there isn't really anyone out there who gets exactly what you're going through. And because of that, by acknowledging that and showing other people with their petty struggles, or not so petty struggles in some cases, by focusing not on this like cosmic world-ending thing, but focusing more on the kids, their relationships, how they care about one another, and what they care about just in the world, and how being saddled with a task that is so far over their head that they can't even comprehend it is fascinating. Like, every step in Homestuck is tied back to this concept of being a kid and just not quite being ready for this. And so we follow their progression, because they do grow up. They do, like, learn and grow. And so does the art, and that's what's fascinating about it, that in the first page, the art and the characters look something like this, and then by page like 9,000 or whatever they have near the end, it's more like this. So obviously they still go back to that more original style from time to time, but like, they don't pull back from anything. Now, the other thing that people really like about Homestuck and its storytelling is that it's unpredictable, but not in the way of like, lol, wacky, so random, unpredictable, although it does do that from time to time. What makes it unpredictable is the same reason Game of Thrones is unpredictable. It doesn't pull its punches. For example, here is a chart of all the different ways people have been dead. There have been a phenomenal number of characters that have died in this series. In fact, most of the characters have died. But an important part of the way that Homestuck approaches death and storytelling is that because it's not completely linear, and because there are things like dream selves and god tears and like other very specific genre concepts, deaths, which still have impact because, yeah, they die, but it isn't the end for that character. Just because your favorite character died doesn't mean you're never going to see them again. You might meet them as a ghost. You might meet them in a dream. You might meet them in the past. But they're around. And so that's this interesting, like, duality, because it still gets to have that, like, Game of Thrones realistic, not everything plays out, sometimes people just die mentality, but still have this high fantasy approach to things that allows them to not have people who were really invested in a character get completely checked out. So that's a lot of why it's a big deal. See, another thing that I just enjoy about it is the art style itself, and how it just goes back and forth between like those very like symbolistic characters and the more detailed drawings. There's actually a reference, like, if you want to know what the art is like in Homestuck, you should know that this is a canon representation of a character, and it is the same character as this. So take that as you will. So let's get into why people don't always go with Homestuck, and why I can't just recommend it to literally everyone and say, you have to read this. The first thing is length. It is an incredibly long series. Homestuck, as a webcomic, is something like 800,000 words long. That is adjusted because some of it is like movies, some of it is a video game. It's kind of a little bit of everything. So there's a lot going on. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you really need to commit to a long period of time to actually get through it. I love that there was so much of it because it just became this, like, mountainous task to, one, get through everything, and two, it meant there was so much to look back on. There's so many little details that, like, if you are the type of person that latches on to specific details, or like the fandom conspiracy theory type thing, it's there because there is so much content that you just kind of connect to it. Another reason that that people don't really jump in is the complexity. Here is a a diagram showing the timeline, the relative timeline following a puppet. It's a very important puppet, but that puppet goes through like 4 universes and at least 3 closed time loops. So, yeah, there's a lot going on in this series, and there's nothing to there's nothing that says that's your thing. There's a lot of people that being this complicated is a huge turnoff, and that's fine, but like there's a lot to it. And the last reason that people really like check out is because it's very silly. Like, even though there is a lot of really fun, really serious stuff in there, there's also a lot of stuff that is just there for the gag, or like it's completely out there, and that's fine because sometimes it approaches the rest of the plot. Sometimes it's just there to help characterize someone. There's very few things that are there for literally no reason. Even though it's that long, most of those pages serve a purpose. That's there so you can meet the characters, so you can learn what they're like. It's there to pull you in more. But if it's the type of thing that someone introduces time travel and you're like, nope, I'm out, then you're gonna lose it somewhere along the line. But that being said, there's a lot here, and there's a reason that people stuck around. And there's something for you for everyone. Most of the time, the series is a comic, and it's in this structure. But sometimes it's an anime, and sometimes it's a video game. This is all the same thing, just following along on that webcomic. It is all part of Homestuck. And that's what's fascinating, because you can go, and you'd think that after however many thousand pages you'd get bored. But it isn't ever the same thing. One part, you're going around trying to figure out how to collect enough of a certain material, well, so that these characters can craft something, and then in the next, you're trying to deal with an interplanetary dog man. Like, it keeps interesting all the way through. Now, I've explained what Homestuck is, to some extent. And I've explained why people might like it and why people don't like it. But I'm going to go into a little bit why that's important. So, the Homestuck community is giant and has spun off a huge amount of content and content creators and all that type of thing, both because of its own internal mechanisms and the ones that it got created because of it. For example, the comic style, like of the image, text, dialogue setup, that has been adopted. Like, that was new at the time and has become popularized, in fact, to the point that there is an entire website that is dedicated to other works of a similar style. Now, these are mostly Homestuck related, but there are other ones like it, and that's something that was unique to it before. There isn't really anything a whole lot like Homestuck, and there still isn't, even though people have attempted it. One of the reasons that the series got so invested was because of the rampant shipping and the complexity of troll romance, which was introduced. This is a grid that someone made to attempt to explain or perhaps theorize some relationships between people. The four suits of the cards are explaining different types of relationships between people, and those types of relationships are actually useful when thinking about other pieces of media, just because they're this other concept that, like, instead of having to say, like, oh, well, they're like platonic soulmates, they have, and trying to explain what that means, there's just a word for it in the Homestuck dialect, which is, I guess, a dialect just because of how many words it has. Also, so because of this, and also because of the simplicity of the costumes, to some extent, the community around it got really involved. Like, there were characters dressed simply with really relatable stories and traits. And because of that, it kind of had a cosplay boom. And so this fandom, for a couple of years, was everywhere. Because it was just... everyone who had read Homestuck could relate to everyone else who had read Homestuck. Because it was sort of like an island of misfit toys, that it was the acknowledgement that everyone knows that they're not perfect, and that everyone else there isn't perfect, and that like common knowledge, that feeling of solidarity, was really what made people like link together. And since then, there's been a whole bunch of fan works. From I have some statistics here, just real quick. There were 27 official albums of music, which were made mostly by people who, like, Hussey met because of the comic. I'm covering that, my bad. But, like, we're just... They're not by Hussey himself. That music was his friends, and then people who got inspired by the comic itself to get put into the series as it popped along. And then there have also been at least 9 major fan-made albums that are just music in that style, that people have decided, like, yeah, no, this is something I'm interested in and would like to produce more of. There are 15,000 fanfics on fanfic.net alone. And then there's even a community going now in that there is a Discord for Homestuck and Hiveswap, and at time of recording there is 1,500 people online. There are 1,500 people right now that can still identify as Homestucks, that think that is something that they currently want to discuss with other people. And now, they've even progressed from there, because in addition to, like, just having their own fanfics or whatever and being into their shipping, like, they've created their own websites for it. Like, this is a website that was made especially for role-playing for various characters and stuff. They've had music hosting sites. The Homestuck video game itself has created the What Pumpkin Studios, which is a brand new video game studio that had to get made from the ground up in order to make the Homestuck video game because of some internal drama. But the people working there, almost all of them got their start either animating or maybe not their start, but like they rose to prominence animating or making music or doing development for Homestuck. Like that, they were all part of that fandom and evolved as people because of that. And the most iconic one because of that, the ones that everyone would probably know, is Undertale. Toby Fox, the lead dev and the music writer for Undertale, got his major start by doing the music for the first parts of Homestuck. And there's actually a running joke that the reason that the game is called Undertale is because Toby Fox, and this is true, actually developed the first parts of it in Andrew Hussey's basement because he was living there. In fact, Megalovania, the iconic final song from the Genocide Endings boss, was made famous, I guess, brought to the center by Homestuck. It was in Homestuck as one of his flashes, even though before that it had also been in an Earthbound mod. But it was... people knew Megalovania before Undertale even came around. And, even now, they're still making more music and more content and all that kind of stuff for Homestuck, to the point that there are these albums of music, like The Lands of Fans and Music 4, which came out, 3 days ago, and is 100 new songs in that style. Really, Homestuck started as a simple comic about a boy and his friends playing a game, then turned into this cosmic tale of trying to save the universe. But it never stopped being about the kid and his friends. And that's what got people. There was so much and so deep, and there's a lot just to work with from Homestuck that people sort of disregard when they think of it as just oh, it's a webcomic. Oh, it's the thing the trolls came from. It had some neat animation. All of those things are true, and it being long is a big deal, but what made it important, what made it click, was that these characters felt real all the way through. So yeah, I guess if you really had to ask, that's what Homestuck is. Any questions?